Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 132, New Land, Old Land. This podcast is recorded in Te Whanganui Atara on the rohe of Mueupoko, Taranaki Whanui, Te Atiawa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira. We are generously supported by our amazing patrons. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/History Aotearoa. Last time, we went over the instructions that Abel Tasman had been given by his bosses in the Batavian Council regarding the voyage he was about to undertake. Today, we will see whether he managed to hold to those orders for the first part of his journey. Before we get there though, there is one more thing that's worth talking about. How we actually know any of the stuff I'm about to tell you. That's to say, what are our sources for this expedition? Specifically, the primary sources, which are the ones that were written at the time of the historical event. Usually these are charters, newspapers, letters, and things like that. In this case, our main primary sources are journals written by people while they were on the expedition, of which 4 survive to us today. 2 of them are the official ship's journal that Tasman kept, detailing anything from the weather that day and their coordinates to charts and drawings of various coastlines as viewed from the ship, as well as a description of any notable events. However, the journal doesn't survive in its original form, but we do have copies of it that were made immediately after the voyage. The intent of these was to have a record in each of the VOC chambers in the Netherlands, and also to distribute them to people in the company who were planning voyages in the area, or to update maps. One of these ended up in the Netherlands State Archives in 1867. As such, it is often referred to as the state copy. The other journal is called the Heidekoper copy, named after the family who owned it for a number of years. These documents are very clearly derived from the same text, presumably the original journal that was written on the Heemskerk in 1642/43. They have a number of similarities, but they do also diverge in a bunch of places too. Events and data from the Heidekoper copy aren't mentioned in the state copy, such as coastal illustrations in the former having compass bearings next to them, which the latter doesn't have. Despite these discrepancies, by and large they match pretty well, which is why scholars think that they must have the same original source. However, this does present a slight problem for us. Which copy do we use to inform these episodes? Perhaps we should favour one over the other, and if so, which one? Well, the state copy must have been made when Tasman was still alive, because he actually signed it under the last entry, which indicates that he considered that version to be the authoritative account of the expedition. As a result, that version is widely considered by scholars to be the superior, more accurate copy out of the 2, because the Heidekoper copy doesn't have Tasman's signature, as well as the fact that the state copy is owned by the Dutch state and kept in the National Archives, which kinda gives it a bit more prestige and validity. So, given that information, but also the fact that the journals don't actually deviate from each other too much, I have used the state copy as a base for these episodes, with a few extra bits from the Heidekoper copy and the 2 other journals here and there. On top of this, it is also good to keep in mind that both journals are not in Aotearoa. The state copy is in the Netherlands, and the Heidekoper copy is in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, Australia. So I don't have access to the original documents to read for myself. Although it wouldn't really matter even if I could get my hands on them, because they're obviously written in Dutch, and that's a language I can't read. So when I say these episodes are based on the state copy, what I mean is I have read books and articles that pull from that version. In saying that, I have read an English translation of the state copy. Actually, that's not true. I'll be honest, I didn't read the whole thing. A lot of it is really boring, with weeks of nothing happening while they're out on the open ocean. Pretty much every day has an entry, and for most of it, it's just, what's the weather doing, what's our coordinates, what's our heading, and if you're lucky, we saw some seaweed today. So the fact that I didn't read every single entry, I don't think is cheating. I read the good bits, I read the important bits, and if there was anything else that was interesting, most of the other books would have mentioned it. Look, I'm just telling you all this so you know where I'm coming from, but also to show you that sometimes history isn't really all that glamorous. Sometimes it's just reading entry after entry that says virtually the same thing. Moving on, the other thing I should note is that I'm going to be saying things like, Tasman wrote this in the journal, or Tasman mentions this in the journal. This isn't technically correct. It's unlikely that Tasman himself was the one doing the actual pen-to-paper writing. More than likely, that job went to the Secretary of the Council, Abraham Coomans. Tasman would likely be too busy running the ship to also be writing everything down in the book. However, there likely was at least some input from Tasman, perhaps reviewing the day's entry before bed. Since he signed his name at the end of the journal, we know he at least agreed with everything written upon the expedition's conclusion, regardless of what input he may have had at the time of recording. The other two journals were ones kept by members of the crew, which was actually illegal since the security around those was much more lax, meaning there was a higher chance they would fall into enemy hands and allow them to find any profitable lands Tasman found, negating pretty much the whole expedition. One of these copies was written by an unknown sailor on the Heemskerk, and other than the fact that he wrote this journal, we don't really know much about who he was. The so-named sailor's copy was handed to the Dutch State Archives in 1859, and unfortunately it has a fair number of issues, primarily with the dates recorded in each entry. The person who wrote it, or perhaps the person who later copied it, seems to not have counted the whole month that the expedition spent in Mauritius, and, as such, recorded that they left on the 8th of September instead of the 8th of October, putting all the subsequent dating out of whack. Adding to this is that the journal gives September 31 days and October 30 days, which is not right, it's the other way around. The same issue is repeated over and over, with November incorrectly being given 31 days, December also being given 31 days, which is correct, but then January has 30 days, which is incorrect. February gets 28 days, which is obviously right, thank God for that. Then March has 30 days, and April 31 days, both of which are wrong. Combining this with the fact that just a whole month apparently went missing, it truly fucks with the dating in this journal. So, even though we can ignore the given dates and figure out when certain things happened based on other evidence, it does limit its usefulness, and does cast doubt on the rest of its contents. The sailor also records the coordinates for each day, and the latitudes given in the journal are generally pretty close to what the state copy shows, but the longitudes definitely don't. They are often way off. That isn't a huge surprise though, because as we've talked about, the longitude problem hadn't been solved yet. there wasn't an accurate way to calculate it at this time, and in fact it was a point of contention sometimes among the ship's council on this expedition, as well as causing innumerable other problems over the centuries before and after. What makes the sailor's journal useful is that it's just some guy writing about whatever he wants, meaning that he records some events that the state copy doesn't mention at all. The final journal doesn't have a fun name, like the sailor's copy or the Heidekoper copy, but I'm going to call it the Halbos copy, because that's who wrote it. Henrik Halbos was the barber surgeon on board one of the ships, and his job was to cut hair and perform surgery, which were kind of the same profession back then, because they both required sharp tools and a lot of dexterity. Slightly higher stakes on one of those jobs though. The Halbos copy is a bit different than the other three journals, as it's not very long and has a more colloquial narrative style. It's just Halbos writing about what he thought was interesting at the time, which, as it happened, was mostly the interactions that they had with indigenous peoples. However, he is rather light on the detail, and actually doesn't offer any more information than the state copy, so it isn't overly useful outside of that specific context. Interestingly, the Halbos copy is actually one of the first accounts of the 1642 expedition ever released to the public, because it was published in a book a few decades later in 1671. Right then, let's crack into some sailing. After some preparation, the expedition was underway on the 12th of August 1642, and, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, almost immediately the Zeehan ran aground, which, to be fair, wasn't uncommon in shallow waters. Thankfully, it didn't cause too many issues, and they headed west towards Mauritius. Along the way, they noted down various measurements in the journal, like their compass heading, the weather, the distance travelled, latitude and longitude, or at least the best guesstimate they had, as well as the amount of degrees difference between compass north and true north, called compass declination. The thought was that if ships recorded these details every day, then the cartographers could accurately calculate longitude. This leg of the journey took 21 days, which was a bit faster than they expected, so when they spotted land, they were a bit suspicious that maybe the land they could see wasn't actually Mauritius, and perhaps they had been blown off course a bit. It also didn't help that they spotted the land at night, meaning they couldn't see much anyway. So they raised to half sail to slow their speed, and kept close to the shore until dawn broke. When the sun finally shone on the island, they realised it was actually Mauritius, and that the coordinates they had been given were slightly off. At this point, it won't surprise you to hear that the part of the coordinates that was incorrect was the longitude. If you hadn't guessed, this is going to be a running theme, and in fact is going to be rather important to our story in about 100 years' time. There is some speculation that Tasman didn't fully trust the coordinates he was given even before they spotted Mauritius. He was an experienced sailor who likely encountered this exact issue before, and would likely explain why he didn't just order them to sail away immediately. If the coordinates were wrong, then it would pay to hang around at least until dawn to figure out if the land they could see was actually where they wanted to be. Having confirmed it was Mauritius, they sailed into the port, and this is where the first 3 coastal illustrations are made, showing various features of the land. These illustrations were designed to be copied and then distributed to ships whose crews weren't familiar with those coasts. As such, the drawings were done from the perspective of someone standing on the deck of a ship, meaning a person could look down at the drawing, look up at the coast, and then, if they were in the right place, the land and drawing would look the same. The whole idea was that sailors could use these illustrations to pinpoint where they were, and what areas were safest when going into shore. Most, if not all, of the coastal drawings made in the ship's journal were done by Gisleman's. That was part of his job on the expedition. So the ones in the State and Haida Cooper copies are pretty much exactly what he drew. Before leaving Batavia, Tasman was given letters to hand over to the VOC representative in Mauritius. And although I couldn't find what these letters contained, my guess would be that at least one of them detailed who Tasman was, why he was there, and ordered the Mauritian authorities to give him provisions and any other help he required. I'd also guess some of it was just general correspondence. Tasman was going there anyway, so he may as well play the part of postman. Tasman had been instructed to stay in Mauritius for no longer than 2 weeks. But as I said earlier, they actually spent a month there. The delay was due to provisioning issues and unexpected repairs that they had to make to the ships. Like the Quast expedition, the Heemskerk and Zeehan weren't in the best nick to begin with. The latter having rotten timber and rigging, which needed to be replaced. And of course, the Zeehan had also taken a bit of damage after running aground in Batavia, so that needed to be addressed as well. So while these repairs were going on, Gisleman's and Vischer took the time to do some charting around the shore. This seems to have been some minor stuff, just updating local charts of the harbour and things like that. Other than this, not much of note seems to have happened until the ship's council met in early October. Remember that this is a meeting of the high-ranking officers of the crew, like Tasman, Pilot Major Vischer, and the skippers of each ship, who were to decide most of the big decisions of the expedition. In this case, they were deliberating on how they wanted to proceed, and when they should leave, choosing the 4th of October. This saw them spending the next few days loading the ships with firewood, pigs, water, and other supplies, with the intention that the next port they see wouldn't be for months. However, unfavourable winds and a rather low tide delayed their departure until the 7th. So during that time, to avoid using their supplies and possibly to just keep the crew occupied, they caught fish for their dinners. Although this sounds pretty nice, hanging out on an island in the Indian Ocean, fishing with your buddies and having a few brews in the sun, it sounds like Tasman was a bit cross at the few days delay. The journal entry on the 7th of October has a rare moment of emotion from the commander, saying, quote, "Whoever has no urgent business here had better keep away," end quote. Once they did get out of the Mauritian harbour, they sailed south to latitude 49 degrees, also known as the 49th parallel south. The reason I bring that up is because when I was Googling to try and understand where the 49th parallel south is, all I would get is links to the 49th parallel north, which is famously the longest straight border in the world between Canada and the United States. This was extremely annoying. Anyway, rant over. While they were sailing south, about 2 weeks after leaving Mauritius, they saw, wait for it, some rockweed and grass in the water. Wow, yeah. Oh, it's so good. Isn't that amazing? In all seriousness, that was quite significant, because it could be a sign that land was nearby. By this point, they were more or less off the map, so any land they sighted now would be a new discovery. At least to them, anyway. This being so early in the expedition, it must have been very exciting to think that they might find something significant so early. possibly even part of Terra Australis, meaning the whole mission will have succeeded before it really began. Naturally, Tasman posted a man to the masthead to keep a constant eye out, and he offered anyone a reward of 3 pieces of 8 and some spirits if they were the first to spot any land. Unfortunately, no one saw anything, so they kept sailing on. It must have been quite the downer to get their hopes up like that and then have them quickly dashed. But again, the voyage had only really just started, so there was plenty of time to write themselves into history. Just before Tasman's ships reached the 49th parallel south, roughly at the end of October, they encountered some hail and snow, which they felt was weird because they were meant to be heading into the summer months, which they thought would have sunnier, warmer days and make for better sailing conditions. Apparently, the sky was so dark and the sea so foggy that they could barely see anything at all, which was not good given they didn't have maps to know where any landmass was, meaning they could run aground at any moment with very little warning. As well as the fact that there was 2 ships, and if they lost contact with each other, that could also be very devastating. This all came to a head on the 6th of November, when they finally reached 49 degrees, and Tasman wrote, quote, "The sea ran very high, and our men began to suffer badly from severe cold." End quote. From the elation of possible glory to a potential maritime disaster, all in the span of a couple of weeks. Such was the dice roll of 17th century exploration. Thankfully for them, they had a very experienced navigator on board who would be able to get them out of this mess. The same day, Vischer proposed a change of plan. You might recall that their original route was to head to the 52nd parallel before heading east. So if they stuck to that, then they still had another 300 kilometres or so to go, which would take them even further south, and almost certainly result in even more terrible weather as they got closer to Antarctica. All in all, not ideal, so instead Vischer proposed they head back north a bit and then continue east, which Tasman and the rest of the council accepted. However, due to the sea running very high, as Tasman puts it, they couldn't convene the ship's council on the Heimskirk, which was preferred. Instead, they floated a wooden box to the Zeehan which contained a letter detailing what they wanted to do and instructed the Zeehan to raise its flag to signal to Tasman that the officers on the flout agreed with that course of action, which they did after some discussion. The funny thing about this is that with this one decision, Vischer changed the entire outcome of the expedition. And if he hadn't done this, then we very likely wouldn't be speaking about him or Tasman today. If you look at Google Earth and follow the 52nd parallel from below Mauritius all the way to the east, you'll notice that they would have sailed well south of Australia and Aotearoa, the next major landmass being South America. Alternate history is a hard thing, so we can never know what would have happened had they followed the original plan. But it's certainly possible that they never would have come across Aotearoa, keeping it shrouded from the world for perhaps slightly longer. But then again, that assumes that they would have survived the cold southern seas. So, Vischer's plan was to sail back to 44 degrees and then head east from there. Other than that, the plan more or less remained the same. Sail east until they either hit Terra Australis or ended up at the longitude of the Solomon Islands, at which point they could decide whether they wanted to continue to find a passage to Chile or to head back north to Batavia. Thus far, things had not gone very well. However, after 7 weeks at sea, with not a single bit of dirt to gaze upon, At about 4 p.m. on the 24th of November, the call went out across the deck. Land had finally been sighted northeast of them. Tasman described seeing, quote, very high land, end quote, and a few hours later they spotted, quote, east-southeast, also 3 high mountains, and in the northeast 2 more mountains, end quote. These shores weren't on any maps or charts. They were truly in the unknown here, which meant that they were the first Europeans to lay their eyes upon this land. Regardless of what happened from here on out, they could at least become a footnote in the big book of history. But even if the crew were overjoyed to see solid Earth, I'm sure there were the words of the Batavian Council rolling around in the back of Tasman's mind. Profitable lands. Given the map was actively being created by ghilliesmans as they spoke, it meant that the rocks, reefs and other hazards of the shoreline that could tear their ships apart were also unknown. As such, after meeting with the ship's council, they decided to hold off any landing for the time being until they could better assess what hazards there were, so that they could make a safe landing. This was a bit of a hallmark of Tasman's leadership style. He was very cautious when it came to his exploratory voyages, taking his time to analyse the risks, and often making sure to keep his ships a safe distance from unfamiliar coasts, in case a stray breeze blew them onto the rocks. It's not explicitly stated whether he did this because he was genuinely concerned for the safety of his crew, or because he didn't want to have to explain to his bosses that he lost a ship and got a bunch of his men killed. But it's probably fair to say that it was a bit of both. Whatever the case, Tasman's caution, while it did likely save his crew's lives on a number of occasions, would come to bite him later on. The next day, the council convened again, where they decided to cautiously approach the coast. But they wouldn't really do that until about 5 p.m, and from there they would sail south to find a place they could safely anchor. As they got closer to the coast, they were constantly monitoring how deep the water was beneath them, to ensure that the ship didn't run aground. This process was called depth sounding, and involved throwing a line with a weight at the end overboard and waiting for it to hit the bottom, or until you ran out of rope. The rope could then be hauled in by taking the line and fully stretching it out across the sailor's arms so that the rope extended his full wingspan, until he brought it all the way back in. 1 fathom, the measurement of water depth, is roughly 1.8 metres, or 6 feet, which is about the full arm's width of a big burly sailor, given the width of a person's arms is usually about the same as a person's height. So if you're 6 foot tall, like me, I'm pretty much exactly 6 foot tall, if you stretch your arms out and look from end to end, that is roughly 1 fathom. So, if it took the sailor 7 full pulls to get the line all the way in, then the water was about 7 fathoms deep. As usual, they also noted down the latitude, the estimated longitude, compass declination, and other such information as was required by the VOC, so that other sailors could find this land again and have the most information to approach it safely. Coastal drawings were being made as this was going on too. The ships must have been abuzz with activity, as the crew went about managing the ships and sails, people leaning over or maybe hanging off the side to get readings and then shouting those back to the skipper, ghilliesmans sitting at the bow scratching in a journal, Tasman barking orders on where to go or to signal the Zehan. It would have been a pretty tense time for them, all relying on each other to do their jobs well, as one false reading could mean a wrong order, which could end up with their ship full of holes and sinking into the ocean. After writing a bunch of technical information, Tasman ends this entry on the 25th of November with, quote, "This land, the first land in the South Sea that we have encountered and not yet known to any European nations. So have we given this land the name of Anthony Van Diemen's Land, in honour of the Honourable Governor-General, our High Superior who has sent us out to make this discovery." End quote. Although they had yet to place their flag, or even feet, upon it, Tasman had established he wanted to name this land in honour of his boss and benefactor, Van Diemen's Land. That name stuck for the next couple of centuries, but in 1856 the name was changed to reflect, at least a little more closely, who was really involved in discovering it. Tasmania. Though, Tasman didn't discover his namesake, did he? There were already people living there, and they had been so for tens of thousands of years. To them, the island was Luturuita, and I wonder what they thought of these new arrivals. Next time, we will talk more about what Tasman got up to in the land he had just, let's say, stumbled across. After that, we follow his journey east, where he will find, well, you know what he finds. If you want to get in touch, my email and social media are on historyaotearoa.com. Aotearoa spelt Aotearoa. You can also find helpful resources there like transcripts and sources. If you'd like to support Hans, you can do so through donating via Patreon or giving us a review. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.